Some moments in life are meant to be perfect, and for Jed Rawlins, his wedding day was supposed to be one of them. After years of loneliness in the mountains, he finally found love with a woman who saw past his rough edges. But just as they were about to say their vows, his loyal dog Boone stepped between them and started growling at the bride. The whole church went silent. Jed tried to calm his dog, but Boone wouldn't move. That's when Jed noticed his bride's hand moving toward something hidden under her flowers. It was a gun. The woman he was about to marry wasn't who she claimed to be. She was a bounty hunter sent to kill him. What had Jed done in his past that was worth this much trouble? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves through the valley as Jed Rawlins had walked toward the little white church that morning, his heart lighter than it had been in years. 5 long years he'd called Sparrow Ridge home, and today marked what he hoped would be the final chapter in his journey from darkness to light. The simple gold band in his vest pocket felt warm against his
chest, a circle of hope he'd purchased.
With honest money earned through honest work, Sheriff. Thomas Murphy had been the first to greet him at the church steps. His weathered face creased in a genuine smile. "Never thought I'd see the day, Jed," the lawman had said, adjusting his badge with pride. "You've done something remarkable here, building a life worth living." The words meant more than Murphy could know. When Jed first arrived in Sparrow Ridge, he'd been little more than a ghost of a man, hollow-eyed, and carrying secrets that weighed heavier than the pack on his shoulders. His only companion then had been Boone, a massive mixed-breed dog with intelligent amber eyes and scars that told their own story of survival in the wilderness. Boone had found him first, actually, 3 days into his journey through the Montana Territory, half dead from exposure and infection from a bullet wound in his shoulder. Jed had collapsed beside a frozen stream. He'd awakened to find the dog sharing his body heat, having somehow dragged him into a shallow cave and kept him alive through the worst blizzard he'd ever seen. From that moment, they'd been inseparable, 2 outcasts who understood the language of loyalty without need for words. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense danger. More than once during their travels, Boone's low growl had warned Jed of approaching riders or suspicious movements in the brush. The animal seemed to read people's intentions in ways that defied explanation, his hackles rising at the first hint of deception or malice. It was this gift that had kept them both alive during those hard months on the trail. When they'd finally stumbled into Sparrow Ridge, both man and dog were shadows of their former selves. The town sat nestled in a valley between rolling hills, its main street lined with modest buildings that spoke of hard work and simple dreams. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith's forge, all bore the marks of a community that took care of its own. Doc Harrison had been the one to patch up Jed's wounds, asking no questions about their origin. The elderly physician had taken one look at the newcomer's condition and simply rolled up his sleeves. "Whatever you're running from," he'd said while cleaning the infected bullet wound, "it's behind you now. What matters is what you do going forward." Those words had planted a seed in Jed's mind, the radical notion that a man might actually change, that the sins of his past didn't have to define his future. He'd taken work at the Murphy Ranch, starting as a simple hand and proving his worth through backbreaking labor that slowly rebuilt his body and, more importantly, his sense of purpose. The townspeople of Sparrow Ridge had a way of accepting folks without prying too deep into their histories. The frontier was full of men and women seeking fresh starts, and the community had learned that a person's actions spoke louder than their past. Jed proved himself through countless small acts, helping elderly Mrs. Patterson with her firewood, lending his strength to barn raisings, sharing his hunting skills during lean winter months. Boone, too, had found his place in the community. The children loved the big dog's gentle nature, and more than one family had benefited from his ability to track lost livestock or sense approaching storms. He became as much a fixture in Sparrow Ridge as the weathered church bell or the old oak tree that shaded the town square. It was under that very oak tree that Jed first met Eloise Carter, or at least the woman who claimed that name. She'd arrived on the afternoon stage 6 months ago, carrying a modest carpet bag and wearing a dress of simple blue calico that somehow made her green eyes shine like emeralds. She'd introduced herself as a school teacher from back east, seeking a position in their growing community. The attraction had been immediate and mutual. Eloise possessed a warmth that seemed to melt the last of the ice around Jed's heart. She laughed easily, spoke with passion about education and the future of the frontier, and showed genuine interest in his dreams of expanding his small ranch. Most remarkably, she seemed to accept his reluctance to discuss his past, understanding that some wounds needed time to heal. Their courtship had unfolded with the gentle rhythm of the changing seasons. Long walks along the creek, shared meals at the boarding house, quiet conversations on the church steps after Sunday services. She'd been patient with his awkwardness around refined company, teaching him small graces without making him feel diminished. When he'd finally worked up the courage to propose, presenting her with his grandmother's cameo ring, her tears of joy had seemed as genuine as spring rain. The engagement had been celebrated throughout the community. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on making the wedding dress, while Doc Harrison had offered his parlor for the reception. Even gruff old Jake Morrison, who ran the saloon, had donated his finest whiskey for the toast. It felt like the entire town was invested in their happiness, as if Jed's redemption somehow validated their collective faith in second chances. But now, standing in that crowded church with Boone's warning growl still echoing in his ears, Jed's world tilted on its axis. The woman he'd planned to spend his life with had her hand wrapped around the grip of a small pistol hidden beneath her bridal bouquet. Her green eyes, which had once gazed at him with such tenderness, now held the cold calculation of a predator. "Easy, Boone," Jed said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned during his years as an outlaw leader. But his mind was racing, processing details he'd overlooked in his happiness. The way she sometimes startled when he moved too quickly. Her knowledge of firearms, which she'd claimed came from her father's hunting expeditions. The occasional hardness that would flash across her features when she thought he wasn't looking. The congregation sat in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing a case of wedding nerves or something far more sinister. Sheriff Murphy's hand had instinctively moved toward his sidearm, while Doc Harrison leaned forward in his pew, ready to respond to whatever crisis might unfold. "Eloise," Jed said carefully, using the name that now felt foreign on his tongue. "Whatever you think you know about me, whatever you've been told, there are things you don't understand." Her laugh was brittle as winter ice. "Oh, I understand plenty, Jedediah Rawlins. Or should I say Jed the Reaper Rawlins, leader of the Devil's Canyon Gang, wanted for the murder of 3 federal marshals and the robbery of the Union Pacific Railroad." The gasps from the congregation hit Jed like physical blows. He saw the shock and fear creeping across faces that had shown him nothing but kindness for 5 years. Mrs. Patterson clutched her chest, while young Timothy Morrison shrank back against his father's protective arm. "That's not who I am anymore," Jed said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "That man died in the mountains. The man standing here built a life worth living, earned the respect of good people through honest work." "Pretty words," the false Eloise replied, her weapon now fully visible as wedding guests scrambled for the exits. "But the price on your head says otherwise. $5,000 dead or alive, enough to set a person up for life, especially someone with the patience to play a long game." Boone's growl deepened, his muscles coiled like springs ready to unleash. The dog had always been Jed's most reliable early warning system, and his agitation had clearly been building for days, possibly weeks. How had Jed missed the signs? Love, it seemed, could make even the wisest man blind to danger standing right beside him. The wanted poster she pulled from beneath her bouquet was weathered and worn, bearing an image that looked like Jed, but somehow different, harder, colder. with eyes that held no hint of the peace he'd found in Sparrow Ridge. The man in that drawing was indeed dead, buried beneath years of honest labor and genuine human connection. But apparently, the law didn't recognize such transformations, as the last of the wedding guests fled the church, leaving only the essential players in this unfolding drama. Jed felt the weight of his past settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome coat. The simple gold band in his vest pocket now felt like a mockery of his hopes, a symbol of dreams that had been built on foundations of sand. But he was no longer the desperate outlaw who had fled into the wilderness 5 years ago. He'd learned the value of community, the power of redemption, and the strength that came from fighting for something worth preserving. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't go down without protecting the life he'd built and the people who'd given him a chance to become something better than his past. The crack of the pistol echoed through the empty church like divine judgment. Jed felt the bullet whistle past his ear as he dove sideways, years of survival instinct overriding the shock of betrayal. Boone launched himself at the false bride with a snarl that seemed to shake the very rafters, his massive frame colliding with her before she could fire again. "Stay down!" Sheriff Murphy shouted, drawing his own weapon as he rushed down the aisle. But the bounty hunter was already rolling away from Boone's attack, her wedding dress tearing as she scrambled behind the altar for cover. Jed's mind snapped into the cold clarity that had once made him the most feared outlaw leader in 3 territories. The man who had spent 5 years learning to be gentle and peaceful found those hard-earned lessons crumbling like autumn leaves. He assessed the situation with the calculating precision of someone who had survived countless gunfights. The bounty hunter's position, Murphy's angle of approach, the civilians still trapped in the building. "Doc, get Mrs. Patterson and the others out the back," Jed called, without taking his eyes off the altar. The elderly physician nodded grimly, helping the handful of remaining guests toward the rear exit. Among them, Jed caught sight of young Timothy Morrison's terrified face and something twisted in his chest. These people had trusted him, welcomed him into their community, and now his past had brought violence into their sacred space. The false Eloise rose slightly above the altar's marble edge, her pristine white dress now stained with dust, and her carefully arranged hair falling in disheveled strands. "You can't run from what you are, Rollins," she shouted, punctuating her words with another shot that splintered the wooden pew beside Jed's head. "The Devil's Canyon gang killed my brother during that railroad job. Marshal William Hayes, maybe you remember him." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Billy Hayes, fresh-faced and eager, barely 25 years old. The kid had drawn on them during the robbery, his hand shaking with either fear or determination. In the chaos that followed, Jed had never been certain whose bullet had found its mark. But the young marshal had died nonetheless, bleeding out in the dust beside the derailed train. "I remember him," Jed said quietly, his voice carrying across the church despite the ringing in his ears. "He was brave. Foolish, but brave." "He was my little brother," she snarled, and for the first time genuine emotion cracked through her professional facade. "Billy was going to be married that Christmas. Had plans to settle down, start a family. You took all of that away." Sheriff Murphy had worked his way around to the side of the church, trying to get a clear shot, but the bounty hunter's position behind the altar made any approach dangerous. "Miss Carter, or whatever your real name is, put down the weapon. We can talk about this." "My name is Sarah Hayes," she replied, shifting position to keep both men in her sights. "And there's nothing to discuss. I've spent 3 years tracking this bastard, learning his habits, becoming someone he could trust. Do you know how long I had to practice being sweet and gentle? How many nights I laid awake listening to him breathe, fighting the urge to slit his throat?" Jed felt the words like knife cuts, each revelation peeling away another layer of the happiness he'd built. Their quiet conversations under the oak tree, the way she'd laughed at his awkward jokes, the tears she'd shed when he proposed, all of it had been an elaborate performance designed to bring him within killing distance. Boone had positioned himself between Jed and the altar, his hackles still raised, but his stance more protective than aggressive now. The dog seemed to sense the emotional undercurrents flowing through the confrontation, understanding that this wasn't just about immediate physical danger, but something deeper and more painful. "Sarah," Jed said, using her real name with careful respect. "Your brother was a good man doing his job. What happened that day, it wasn't supposed to go that way. We'd planned it clean, no violence, but you're killers," she cut him off. "That's what killers do. They kill. You can dress it up with talk of plans and intentions, but Billy died because you chose to live outside the law." The truth of her words settled heavy in Jed's chest. No amount of good deeds in Sparrow Ridge could resurrect Marshal Billy Hayes or undo the pain his death had caused. The man Jed had become understood that, even as the outlaw, he'd been whispered justifications and excuses. "You're right," he said simply, and the admission seemed to surprise her more than any argument could have. "I can't bring Billy back, can't undo the choices I made or the pain they caused. All I can do is try to be better than what I was." "Pretty words don't bring back the dead," Sarah spat. But there was something different in her voice now, a wavering that suggested his honesty had found its mark. Sheriff Murphy chose that moment to make his move, rushing the altar from the side, while Sarah's attention was focused on Jed. But she was quicker than the aging lawman anticipated, spinning and firing in one fluid motion. Murphy cried out and stumbled, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "Thomas!" Jed started toward his friend, but another shot from Sarah's pistol forced him back into cover. "Stay where you are," she commanded, her voice tight with stress and exhaustion. "This doesn't have to involve anyone else. It's just between us, for Billy." From his position behind the overturned pew, Jed could see Murphy propped against the wall, conscious but clearly in pain. Doc Harrison had returned and was tending to the wounded sheriff despite the ongoing danger, his medical instincts overriding personal safety. The sight of these good people suffering because of his past kindled something dangerous in Jed's chest, not the cold fury of his outlaw days, but the protective anger of a man defending his chosen family. "Let Doc help Murphy," Jed called out. "Your quarrel is with me, not them." "My quarrel is with the Devil's Canyon gang," Sarah replied. "Where are the others? Marcus Cole, Tommy Brennan, Snake Eyes Rodriguez? Are they hiding somewhere in this perfect little town too?" The question revealed how much she didn't know about what had happened after the gang's dissolution. Cole had died of fever 2 winters ago, alone in a Denver flophouse. Brennan had been shot down by bounty hunters in New Mexico territory. Rodriguez had simply vanished one day, leaving only rumors and conflicting stories. Of the 6 men who had ridden together, only Jed remained alive to face the consequences of their collective sins. "They're all dead," he said quietly. "I'm the last one." "Good," Sarah said, but the satisfaction in her voice sounded hollow. "Then you can join them." She rose from behind the altar, her pistol trained on Jed's chest with rock-steady aim. In that moment, he saw not just Billy Hayes' sister, but a woman who had sacrificed years of her life to a quest for vengeance that had consumed everything else she might have been. The realization hit him that killing him wouldn't heal her wounds any more than his good deeds had erased his crimes. "Wait," Jed said, raising his hand slowly. "Before you pull that trigger, I want you to know something. These past 6 months, being with you, even if it was all pretense on your part, it reminded me what it felt like to hope again. So thank you for that, even if it was unintentional." For just an instant, something flickered across Sarah's face. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe recognition of the genuine gratitude in his voice. But then her jaw tightened with renewed resolve, and Jed knew that no words would turn her from her chosen path. The future he had dared to imagine, marriage, children, growing old in the peaceful valley of Sparrow Ridge, crumbled like a house of cards in a prairie wind. Whatever happened next would be written in violence and blood, despite all his efforts to leave such things behind. The simple gold band in his vest pocket felt like a weight pulling him toward the grave, a symbol of dreams that had been doomed from the moment he'd put on the Devil's Canyon gang colors all those years ago. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, each second heavy with the weight of unspoken consequences. Jed could hear Doc Harrison's quiet murmurs as he worked on Sheriff Murphy's wounded shoulder, the old physician's steady hands never wavering despite the gun barrel pointed in their direction. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the church windows, a sound that seemed to echo the trembling in Sarah Hayes's extended arm. "You know," Jed said conversationally, his voice pitched to carry across the space between them, "Billy talked about you that day. Before the shooting started, Sarah's aim wavered slightly. Don't. He had your picture in his wallet. Kept showing it to anyone who'd listen, telling them about his big sister, who was training to be a teacher back in Philadelphia. Said you were the smartest person he knew, that you could have done anything with your life." "Shut up," she hissed, but the professional composure was cracking. The woman who had methodically planned and executed a 6-month deception was giving way to a sister still grieving her brother's death. Jed took a careful step forward, his hands still raised but his voice gentle. "He was proud of you, Sarah, even in those last minutes. When everything went to hell, he was talking about how you were going to change the world through teaching children." The pistol in her hands began to shake visibly. "He was going to visit me for Christmas. Had it all planned out. He'd saved enough money for the train ticket and a hotel room. Was going to meet my fiancée, walk me down the aisle when I got married. What happened to your fiancée?" Jed asked quietly. "What do you think happened?" Sarah's voice broke on the words. "When Billy died, I changed. Became someone else entirely. Marcus couldn't understand why I wouldn't let it go, why I couldn't just grieve and move on. He tried to be patient, but eventually he realized he was engaged to a ghost. From his position against the wall," Sheriff Murphy spoke through gritted teeth, "Miss Hayes, this won't bring your brother back. And it won't bring back the woman you used to be." "That woman died with Billy," Sarah replied, but some of the fire had gone out of her voice. "This is all I have left now. All I am." Jed recognized the hollow tone, the empty desperation of someone who had defined themselves entirely by their quest for revenge. He'd seen it in the mirror during those first months after the gang's dissolution, when guilt and self-hatred had been his only companions besides Boone. "I know that feeling," he said. "When the gang fell apart, when I realized what we'd become, I thought the same thing. Figured there was nothing left of me worth saving. It was Boone who proved me wrong." The big dog's ears perked up at the mention of his name, but he remained alert and ready, positioned between Jed and potential danger. Sarah's gaze flicked to the animal, and for a moment her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "He's protective of you," she observed. "Protective of family," Jed corrected. "When I first came to Sparrow Ridge, I thought I was just a man and his dog looking for a place to hide. But this community made us part of something bigger, gave us purpose beyond just surviving." Doc Harrison finished bandaging Murphy's wound and slowly stood, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "The bleeding stopped," he announced, "but he needs rest and proper care." Sarah gestured with her pistol toward the back door. "Take him and go. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," Doc replied with quiet dignity. "See, I took an oath to do no harm. That includes standing by while someone destroys themselves with hatred. Your brother was a lawman, Miss Hayes. What do you think he'd say about you throwing away your life for revenge?" The question hit its mark. Sarah's face contorted with pain that had nothing to do with physical wounds. "Billy believed in justice, in doing what's right. And is this right?" Doc pressed gently. "Becoming the very thing he stood against? Using deception and violence to settle scores?" For a moment, the church fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the eaves. Jed could see the war playing out across Sarah's features. The teacher she'd once been battling against the vengeful hunter she'd become. In that struggle, he recognized his own journey in reverse, watching someone choose darkness where he had finally found light. "You don't understand," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've given everything for this. 3 years of my life, learning to shoot, to track, to lie convincingly. I became someone Billy would have hated just to get close enough to kill his murderer, then honor him by stopping," Jed said. "Choose to be the woman he believed you could be instead of the killer his death made you." Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Easy words from a man who got his redemption handed to him by a friendly town. But not everyone gets a second chance, Rawlins. Some of us have to live with what we've done. What have you done, besides love your brother and grieve his loss? Murphy asked from his position against the wall. The woman who taught school in Philadelphia, who was going to change the world through education, that person's still in there. Buried under pain, maybe, but not gone. She is gone, Sarah insisted, but her grip on the pistol had loosened noticeably. I killed her the day I decided to hunt you down. Everything good about me died with Billy. Jed slowly lowered his hands, a gesture of trust that made Doc Harrison tense visibly. Sarah, I've been where you are, convinced that the worst parts of myself were all that remained. But this town, these people, they saw something worth saving even when I couldn't. Maybe it's time you let someone do the same for you. I'm not you, she said, but the words lacked conviction. No, you're not. You're better. You're someone who chose to become a teacher, who wanted to shape young minds and build a better future. That calling doesn't just disappear because you've lost your way. Outside, Jed could hear the distant sound of approaching horses. Likely some of the wedding guests returning with reinforcements, or perhaps word had reached the neighboring ranches. Whatever happened next, this confrontation would have to resolve soon, one way or another. Sarah seemed to hear the sounds too, her head tilting slightly as she listened. When she looked back at Jed, something fundamental had shifted in her expression. The cold certainty of a professional killer had given way to the confused anguish of a woman who had lost everything that mattered and wasn't sure how to find her way back. The Billy I knew wouldn't want his death to destroy his sister's life, Jed said gently. He'd want you to live, to teach, to love again, to be the person he bragged about to strangers in the last moments of his life. The pistol trembled in Sarah's hands like a leaf in autumn wind, and for the first time since entering the church, Jed allowed himself to hope that this might end without more bloodshed. But hope, he'd learned, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the weight of past mistakes and present choices. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by urgent voices calling out across the valley. Sarah's head snapped toward the windows, her professional instincts reasserting themselves as she calculated new variables in an already complex situation. The moment of vulnerability passed like a cloud shadow across the sun, leaving only the hardened resolve of someone who had spent 3 years preparing for this confrontation. Step away from them, she commanded, her pistol swinging back toward Jed with renewed steadiness. Whatever reinforcements are coming, they won't change anything. I didn't track you across 3 territories to give up now because of some pretty words about redemption. Jed remained motionless, recognizing the shift in her demeanor. The grieving sister had retreated behind the cold facade of the bounty hunter, and he knew from experience how dangerous such people could be when cornered. Sarah, those riders could be anyone. Ranchers, townspeople, maybe even federal marshals. You sure you want to face all of them? I've been preparing for this day longer than you've been playing house in your peaceful valley, she replied. You think I came here without an escape plan? Without considering every possible contingency? Doc Harrison cleared his throat softly. Miss Hayes, if I may ask, what happens after? Say you succeed in your mission, what then? Where does Sarah Hayes go when her brother's killer is dead? The question seemed to catch her off guard, as if she'd never seriously considered life beyond this moment. That's not your concern. But it is, isn't it? Murphy said, pressing his good hand against his wounded shoulder. Because deep down you know this won't end your pain. It'll just leave you empty, with nothing left to live for. Outside, the voices grew more distinct. Jed recognized Jake Morrison's gruff tone among them, along with what sounded like several of the ranch hands from the surrounding spreads. The wedding guests had indeed returned with help, though whether that help would escalate or resolve the situation remained to be seen. They're good people, Jed said, nodding toward the approaching sounds. Whatever you think of me, don't let your need for revenge hurt innocent folks who've never done you any harm, like my innocent brother. Sarah's voice cracked slightly on the words. He never hurt anyone either, was just doing his job, trying to make the frontier a safer place for families like the ones in this town. The parallel wasn't lost on Jed. Billy Hayes had indeed been trying to protect innocent people when he'd drawn his gun that day. The irony that his own desire to protect Sparrow Ridge now put him in a similar position wasn't something he could ignore. Boone shifted restlessly, his ears tracking the approaching riders, while his eyes remained fixed on Sarah. The dog's tension was palpable, a living barometer of the danger still crackling through the church's sacred space. Jed had learned to trust that instinct completely, and right now it was telling him that Sarah Hayes was far from finished. "You know what the hardest part has been?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made her more frightening than her earlier anger. "It wasn't learning to shoot or tracking you across half the country. It was becoming someone Billy would have despised." She gestured around the church with her free hand, taking in the simple wooden pews and modest altar. This place, this community, it's exactly the kind of thing he wanted to protect. He used to talk about settling down somewhere like this when his martial days were over. Finding a good woman, raising children who could grow up safe and free. The approaching voices were close enough now that individual words could be distinguished. Jake Morrison was apparently organizing a group to surround the church, while someone else, possibly Tom Bradley from the neighboring ranch, was arguing for a more cautious approach. "They're going to try to help," Jed observed. "These people don't know how to abandon someone in trouble." "Then they're fools," Sarah replied, but there was something almost wistful in her tone. Billy was like that too, always ready to help anyone who needed it, even if it put him at risk. Doc Harrison had been quietly observing the exchange while keeping one eye on Murphy's condition. Now he spoke up with the gentle authority of someone who had seen too much suffering in his long life. "Miss Hayes, I've delivered more than 100 babies in this valley, patched up countless injuries, and sat with families during their darkest hours. You know what I've learned? Pain shared becomes more bearable, but pain nursed alone becomes poison." "Pretty philosophy, Doc," Sarah said. "But some pain is meant to be carried alone, is it?" Jed asked. "Because from where I stand, it looks like your pain has been eating you alive for 3 years. How much more of yourself are you willing to sacrifice to it?" Before Sarah could answer, a voice called out from just outside the church doors. Jake Morrison, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling trouble. "Jed, you and the others all right in there?" Sarah's grip tightened on her pistol. "Tell them to stay back, or I start shooting through the windows." "Jake," Jed called out, his voice carefully controlled. "We're talking things through in here. Give us some more time." Doc Harrison poked his head out the back about 10 minutes ago. "Said there was trouble," Jake replied. "What kind of talking involves gunshots?" "The complicated kind," Jed answered. "Just keep everyone back for now, please." There was a moment of silence from outside. Then Jake's reluctant voice. 5 more minutes. Jed, then we're coming in, ready or not." Sarah laughed bitterly. 5 minutes to solve 3 years of pain and planning. "Think you're up to it, Rollins?" "I think I'm going to try," Jed replied simply. "Because whatever happened between Billy and the gang, whatever mistakes were made, destroying yourself won't honor his memory." "You don't get to tell me how to honor my brother," Sarah snapped. But the words lacked her earlier venom. "No, I don't," Jed agreed. "But I knew him, even if only briefly. And the man I met wouldn't want his death to be the reason his sister threw away everything good about herself." Outside, the waiting crowd had gone quiet, as if sensing that the real confrontation was happening in the space between words, in the battle between grief and healing that was playing out in the heart of a woman who had lost her way. The silence that followed Jake Morrison's ultimatum felt heavier than the Montana winters Jed remembered from his outlaw days. Sarah's breathing had become shallow and rapid, the weight of years of planning and preparation pressing down on her as the moment of truth approached. In the distance, he could hear the soft murmur of the gathered townspeople, their voices carrying the concern and confusion of a community that had never expected violence to invade their sanctuary. "You want to know something?" Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I practiced this conversation 100 times, imagined exactly what I'd say when I finally faced you, how I'd make you understand what your actions cost my family." She shifted her position slightly, and Jed noticed how her wedding dress, the costume she'd worn to get close to him, was now torn and stained with dust and sweat. The careful facade of Eloise Carter had completely crumbled, revealing the hollow-eyed woman beneath who had spent 3 years living for nothing but revenge. "But now that we're here," she continued, "I realize I never thought past this moment. Never planned for what happens after Billy's death is avenged." Doc Harrison spoke up gently, his medical training extending beyond physical wounds to the deeper injuries of the human heart. "Perhaps that's because some part of you knows this won't heal what's broken. Miss Hayes, revenge might silence the anger for a moment, but it can't fill the emptiness your brother's death left behind. Then what can?" Sarah demanded. And for the first time since revealing her true identity, she sounded genuinely lost rather than merely dangerous. "How do you go on when the person who mattered most in the world is gone?" Jed felt the question like a blade between his ribs, remembering his own journey through grief and guilt after the gang's dissolution. "You don't get over it," he said quietly, "but you can learn to carry it differently. Turn it into something that honors their memory instead of something that destroys yours." Easy for you to say. "You're the one who lived. Living and being alive aren't the same thing," Jed replied. "I spent 2 years after Billy's death existing like a ghost, convinced I deserved nothing but misery. It was this town, these people, who showed me that survival could be transformed into purpose." Sheriff Murphy, despite his wounded shoulder, managed to sit up straighter against the wall. "Miss Hayes, I've been wearing a badge for 23 years. Seen more than my share of good men die doing their duty. You know what I learned? The worst thing we can do is let their sacrifice become meaningless by allowing it to poison the lives of those they died trying to protect." "Billy didn't die protecting anyone," Sarah said bitterly. "He died because he was young and eager and thought he could stop a gang of killers with righteous determination." "Maybe," Jed acknowledged, "but he also died believing in something bigger than himself. In law and order, in the idea that people should be able to live without fear. That belief doesn't have to die with him." Outside, the 5 minutes Jake Morrison had given them were ticking away with the relentless pace of a clock counting down to judgment. Jed could sense the growing restlessness of the gathered crowd, their patience wearing thin as they waited for resolution to a crisis they didn't fully understand. Boone had remained statue still throughout the conversation, but now the big dog took a careful step forward, his amber eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that spoke of canine wisdom humans often overlooked. The movement was deliberate, non-threatening, but it caused Sarah to tense and raise her pistol slightly. "He's not going to hurt you," Jed said quickly. "Boone can sense pain in people. Always could. He's trying to understand what's driving you." "A dog's sympathy won't bring back my brother," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "No, but it might remind you that not everything in this world is about death and vengeance," Doc Harrison observed. "That animal has been Jed's anchor to humanity for 5 years. Maybe he's trying to be yours too." Sarah's gaze flicked between the dog and the 3 men, and Jed could see the war raging behind her eyes. The teacher she'd once been was fighting against the hunter she'd become, and the outcome of that battle would determine whether anyone walked out of this church alive. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I can barely remember Billy's laugh anymore. Used to be the first thing I'd think of when I woke up, but now all I can hear is the sound of gunshots and dying men. 3 years of hatred have erased the joy I was supposed to be preserving." The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy with grief and regret. Jed recognized the particular agony of losing not just a loved one, but the memories that should have sustained their legacy. He'd watched it happen to other members of the gang, good men who had let guilt consume even their happiest recollections. "Memories aren't lost," he said gently. "They're just buried under other things. Pain, anger, the weight of choices that felt necessary at the time. But they're still there, waiting to be uncovered." "How would you know?" Sarah demanded. "Because I forgot my sister's voice for almost 2 years." Jed replied, the words coming from a place he rarely allowed himself to visit. Mary Beth died of fever when she was 12, and I carried that guilt into my outlaw days. Convinced myself I'd failed to protect her, that I didn't deserve to remember her sweetness. It wasn't until I started helping the children here in Sparrow Ridge that I heard her laughter again. The revelation seemed to surprise Sarah, as if she'd never considered that the man she'd been hunting might have his own ghosts to carry. You had a sister, still do in the ways that matter. Just like you still have Billy's memory, if you can find your way back to the love instead of the loss. Outside, Jake Morrison's voice cut through the afternoon air one final time. Time's up. Jed, we're coming in. Sarah's knuckles went white around the pistol grip as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the church's front entrance. Whatever choice she was going to make, whatever path she would choose between vengeance and healing, the moment of decision had finally arrived. The heavy wooden doors of the church creaked open, with the slow deliberation of men who expected trouble, but hoped to avoid it. Jake Morrison's weathered face appeared first, his eyes quickly scanning the scene before him, the wounded sheriff against the wall, Doc Harrison standing with his hands visible, Jed positioned near the center aisle, and Sarah Hayes in her torn wedding dress, holding a pistol with the steady grip of someone who knew how to use it. Well now, Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd faced down rustlers and claimed jumpers in his younger days. This is a sight I never expected to see in our church. Behind him, Jed could make out the faces of other townspeople, Tom Bradley from the neighboring ranch, old Pete Wilson from the general store, and several others whose expressions ranged from confusion to concern to barely controlled anger. These were people who had welcomed him into their community, who had celebrated his engagement just hours ago, and now they were discovering that their friend and neighbor had been living under an assumed identity. "Stay back, all of you," Sarah commanded, swinging her pistol toward the newcomers. "This doesn't concern anyone but me and Rawlins." "Afraid it does concern us, miss," Tom Bradley said, stepping up beside Jake. "See, Jed's been part of this community for 5 years now. Helped build my barn when the old one burned down, sat with my wife when our boy had the fever. We don't take kindly to folks threatening our own." The simple declaration of loyalty hit Jed harder than he'd expected. These people knew the truth about his past now, had heard Sarah's accusations about the Devil's Canyon Gang and the federal marshals, yet they still considered him one of theirs. The weight of that acceptance was both humbling and terrifying. "Your own?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Do you have any idea who you've been protecting? Jed the Reaper Rawlins killed 3 federal marshals, robbed trains, terrorized half the territory. The man you're defending is a murderer." "Maybe he was," Jake acknowledged, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "But that's not who he's been in Sparrow Ridge. The man I know helped deliver Mrs. Patterson's baby when Doc couldn't get there in time. The man I know sits with dying horses so they don't have to face the end alone. Whatever sins he's carrying from his past, he's been working to make amends." Pete Wilson nodded agreement from behind the others. "Saved my granddaughter from drowning in the creek last spring. Dove right in without thinking about his own safety. Good deeds don't erase murder," Sarah said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. The unexpected support these people were showing for Jed was clearly not something she'd anticipated in her carefully laid plans. Sheriff Murphy spoke up from his position against the wall, his voice strained but determined. "Miss Hayes, I've been lawman long enough to know the difference between justice and revenge. What you're seeking here ain't justice. Then what is it?" she demanded. "Pain looking for a place to land," Doc Harrison said gently. "And these good people standing here, they don't deserve to carry the weight of your grief." Jed watched the play of emotions across Sarah's face as she looked from one townsperson to another. These weren't the anonymous bystanders she'd probably imagined when planning this confrontation. They were real people with names and faces and stories, individuals who had chosen to stand between her and her target despite the obvious danger. "I spent 3 years preparing for this," she said, her voice beginning to waver. learning everything about him, about this place. I knew about the ranch, the community involvement, all of it. I thought it was just a disguise, a way for him to hide in plain sight. And what if it's not? Jake asked. What if a man can actually change, become something better than what he was? What if the person you've been hunting doesn't exist anymore? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jed found himself holding his breath, wondering if Sarah could see past her need for vengeance to consider the possibility that redemption might be real, that people could indeed transform themselves through conscious choice and community support. Boone chose that moment to take another careful step forward, his massive frame moving with surprising gentleness. The dog stopped just beyond arm's reach of Sarah, then slowly lowered himself to the floor in a gesture that somehow managed to be both submissive and protective. The action was so unexpected, so purely peaceful, that it seemed to drain some of the tension from the room. "He's trying to help," Jed said quietly. Boone's always been able to sense when someone's hurting. Been doing it for 5 years, with everyone from scared children to wounded animals. "He knows you're in pain, Sarah." "I don't want his help," she whispered, but the words came out broken and uncertain. "Maybe not," Doc Harrison agreed. "But maybe you need it anyway. Maybe we all do, sometimes." Tom Bradley stepped forward slightly, his calloused hands held open and visible. "Miss Hayes, I don't know your story, and I won't pretend to understand your pain. But I do know that whatever you're carrying, it's eating you alive. We've all seen that look before, in soldiers coming back from Indian wars, in women who've lost children to fever. Grief can be a poison if you let it fester. Billy was everything to me," Sarah said, her voice barely audible now. "After our parents died, he was all the family I had left. When he became a marshal, I was so proud. So sure he was going to make the world a better place." "Maybe he did," Jake suggested. "Maybe his death led to changes that prevented other families from suffering the same loss. Maybe his sacrifice meant something, even if it doesn't feel that way now." Outside the church, Jed could hear the restless movement of horses and the quiet conversations of other townspeople who had gathered but remained at a respectful distance. The entire community seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve itself, whether it would end in more bloodshed or somehow find a path toward healing. The moment stretched like a bowstring, pulled to its breaking point. And then Sarah Hayes did something that shocked everyone in the church. She began to laugh. Not the bitter sound she'd made earlier, but something closer to hysteria. The kind of laughter that comes when a person realizes they've been living a lie so complete it borders on madness. 3 years, she said, lowering her pistol slightly as the laughter died in her throat. 3 years of planning and hunting and becoming someone I despised, all based on information that might not even be true. Jed felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the church's old windows. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" She reached into the torn bodice of her wedding dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, not the wanted poster she'd shown earlier, but something else, something that looked like it had been read and reread countless times until the creases were worn soft. "This is the letter that started it all. The one that told me who killed my brother." Doc Harrison took a careful step forward, his medical instincts recognizing the signs of someone on the edge of complete breakdown. "Who sent you that letter, Miss Hayes?" "A man calling himself Marcus Cole," Sarah replied, her voice taking on a dreamy, disconnected quality. "Said he was a former member of the Devil's Canyon gang who wanted to make amends for past crimes. Told me that Jed Rawlins had personally killed Billy. Shot him down in cold blood during the railroad robbery. Jed's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Marcus Cole, his former partner, the man Sarah thought was dead." "Sarah, Marcus Cole isn't dead. And if he told you I killed Billy personally, he was lying." "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Jake Morrison exchanged glances with the other townspeople, sensing that something fundamental was shifting in the dynamic of this confrontation. "Jed, you want to explain what you mean by that?" Jed ran his hands through his hair, his mind racing as pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed began falling into place. Marcus Cole was my lieutenant in the gang. Smart, charming, completely ruthless when it suited his purposes. When the gang fell apart after the railroad job, he disappeared. I assumed he'd died like the others, but if he contacted Sarah, he looked directly at the woman who had spent 6 months convincing him she loved him, seeing her now not as a calculating killer, but as another victim of Marcus Cole's manipulations. Sarah, during the robbery, it was chaos. Gunfire everywhere, people screaming, horses panicking. I couldn't tell you who fired the shot that killed your brother because there were 6 of us shooting and at least a dozen federal marshals returning fire. But Marcus said what he needed to say to set you on my trail, Jed interrupted. The question is why? What does he gain by having you kill me? Sheriff Murphy struggled to sit up straighter despite his wounded shoulder. Could be he's got unfinished business with you. Maybe blames you for the gang's dissolution. Wants revenge, but doesn't want to risk his own neck getting it. Tom Bradley spoke up from near the door, his rancher's practical mind cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Or maybe there's something else entirely going on here, something we're not seeing. Sarah stared at the letter in her hands as if it had suddenly transformed into a poisonous snake. He was so convincing, so detailed about what happened that day. He even knew about Billy's personal effects, the things that were found on his body, details that would have been in any newspaper account of the robbery, Doc Harrison observed gently, or that he could have learned from talking to other survivors. The implications were hitting Sarah like physical blows. If Marcus Cole had lied about the specifics of Billy's death, if he had manipulated her grief and anger to turn her into a weapon pointed at Jed, then everything she'd done for the past 3 years, abandoning her teaching career, learning to kill, becoming someone her brother would have hated, had been for nothing. There's more, Sarah said suddenly, her voice hollow with dawning realization. Marcus didn't just tell me about Billy's death. He's been feeding me information about you for months. Your location, your daily routines, even details about this wedding. Jed felt the pieces clicking together in his mind, forming a picture that made his stomach clench with dread. He's been watching Sparrow Ridge, probably for months, maybe longer. But why? Jake asked. What's his endgame? Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats, different from the earlier arrivals, faster and more urgent, echoed across the valley. Boone's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's reaction sent alarm bells ringing in Jed's mind. "Everyone get down," he ordered, his old instincts taking over as he recognized the particular cadence of riders moving with military precision. The church windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and gunfire as black-clad figures on horseback swept past, their rifles speaking with deadly accuracy. Jake Morrison cried out and stumbled, clutching his leg, while Pete Wilson dove behind a pew as bullets splintered the wood around him. Cole, Jed breathed, understanding flooding through him like cold water. Marcus hadn't just manipulated Sarah into hunting him. He'd used her as bait to draw Jed into the open, to gather all of Sparrow Ridge's defenders in one place where they could be eliminated efficiently. Through the broken windows, Jed could see riders circling the church, their faces hidden behind bandanas, but their tactics unmistakably professional. These weren't random outlaws or opportunistic raiders. They were Cole's new gang, and they'd come to Sparrow Ridge not just to kill Jed, but to eliminate anyone who might stand in their way. "The bank," Tom Bradley gasped from behind his makeshift cover. "They're after the bank. All that money from the cattle sales, the deposit from the grain harvest. It's all sitting there waiting for the weekly transport." Sarah Hayes stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her pistol forgotten in her hand as she realized the full scope of how she'd been used. Not only had Marcus Cole manipulated her into hunting an innocent man, he'd used her obsession to scout the target, to learn the town's defenses and routines, to identify the perfect moment to strike when everyone would be distracted by a wedding celebration. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible over the continuing gunfire. "And God help me, I'm so sorry." But apologies, Jed knew, wouldn't stop bullets or save the community that had given him a second chance at life. The past he'd tried so hard to escape had finally caught up with him, and now everyone he cared about was paying the price for the sins of the Devil's Canyon gang. The gunfire ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the acrid smell of black powder and the soft groans of wounded men echoing through the bullet-riddled church. Jed pressed himself against an overturned pew, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. The attack had been precisely timed and executed, a coordinated assault designed to pin down the town's defenders while the real objective played out elsewhere. "Sound off," he called quietly. "Who's hit?" Jake Morrison's voice came from near the altar, tight with pain but steady. "Took one in the leg, but I can still shoot." "Glass cuts, nothing serious," Tom Bradley reported from behind a shattered window. Pete Wilson raised a shaky hand from his position near the back door. "I'm all right, just scared half to death." Doc Harrison was already moving despite the danger, his medical bag somehow having appeared in his hands as he crawled toward Jake's position. Sheriff Murphy remained conscious, but was clearly in no condition to fight. His earlier shoulder wound complicated by the stress and exertion of the past hour. Sarah Hayes stood in the center of the destruction like a statue carved from guilt and regret, her wedding dress now torn and bloodstained, the letter from Marcus Cole still clutched in her trembling hand. The full weight of her manipulation was written across her face, 3 years of her life stolen, her brother's memory perverted, and now an entire community suffering because of her unwitting assistance to their enemy. "Sarah," Jed said gently, crawling toward her while staying low, "I need you to focus. How many men did Cole have with him when you met?" She blinked slowly, as if coming back from a great distance. I never met him in person. All our communications were through letters and dead drops. But he mentioned having loyal followers, men who understood the value of careful planning. That's Cole's style," Jed muttered. "Always preferred manipulation to direct confrontation. He's probably been building a new gang for months, maybe years, using the information you gathered to plan this raid. Through the broken windows, they could hear the distant sounds of chaos spreading through Sparrow Ridge, shouting voices, running horses, the occasional crack of gunfire from the direction of the bank. The wedding celebration had turned into a nightmare, with Cole's men undoubtedly taking advantage of the confusion to loot the town's accumulated wealth. Boone had positioned himself near one of the windows, his massive head low as he watched for movement outside. The dog's ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds that human hearing couldn't detect. Suddenly he stiffened, a low growl building in his chest. "Someone's coming," Jed announced, checking his pistol and finding it woefully inadequate for the situation they faced. "Jake, you still carrying that rifle you brought for bear hunting?" "Under the back pew," Jake confirmed through gritted teeth as Doc Harrison worked on his leg wound. "But I only had time to grab a few rounds before we came running to help." The sound of approaching footsteps crunched through the broken glass outside, moving with the deliberate caution of professionals who expected resistance. Jed counted at least 3 distinct sets of boots, probably more circling around to cover the church's other exits. "Listen up," came a familiar voice from just outside the front door, smooth, cultured, with the slight accent that Marcus Cole had always claimed came from his Eastern education. "I know you're in there, Jed, you and whatever's left of this pathetic town's defenders." Jed's jaw tightened at the sound. 5 years of peace and honest work crumbled away as the voice of his former lieutenant brought back memories of blood and betrayal. "Marcus, should have known you'd survive like a cockroach." Cole's laughter drifted through the broken windows. "Always the charmer. You know, I have to thank you for making this so easy. When I realized you'd gone soft, playing house in this little valley, I knew exactly how to flush you out. Using an innocent woman's grief," Doc Harrison called out, his voice heavy with disgust. "That's low even for you, Cole." "Innocent?" Cole's tone turned mocking. "Miss Hayes spent 3 years learning to kill, tracking a man across 3 territories, deceiving an entire community. I'd hardly call that innocent. I simply gave her talents proper direction." Sarah flinched as if struck, the truth of Cole's words hitting harder than any physical blow. She had indeed become something her brother would have despised, regardless of her motivations or the lies that had guided her actions. "What do you want, Marcus?" Jed called out, buying time while his mind worked through their limited options. The church provided some cover, but they were outnumbered and outgunned, with wounded men and no easy escape routes. What I've always wanted. My fair share of what the Devil's Canyon gang took in our glory days. You remember that last job, Jed? The Union Pacific train? We made off with more than just cash and gold. There were bearer bonds, land grants, territorial scrip, enough paper to set a man up for life if he knew how to use it properly. The memory came flooding back, documents they'd taken almost as an afterthought, focusing on the more immediately valuable gold and currency. In the chaos that followed Billy Hayes' death and the gang's dissolution, those papers had been forgotten, left behind when Jed fled into the wilderness. "I don't have any of that," Jed said truthfully. "Left it all behind when I came here." "Oh, but you do," Cole replied, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "See, I did some research over the years. Discovered that one of those land grants covered a significant portion of this very valley. The territorial government's been looking for the rightful owner for 5 years now, ready to legitimize the claim and turn it into legal ownership of some very valuable property." The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. Without realizing it, he'd been living on land that technically belonged to the Devil's Canyon gang, or more specifically, to whoever held the stolen documents that proved ownership. Cole hadn't just come to Sparrow Ridge for the bank's money. He'd come to claim what he saw as his rightful inheritance. "That's why you waited so long," Jed said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You needed me here, establishing residency, improving the land, making it valuable. Then you could take it all." "Exactly. Though I must admit, I never expected you to be quite so thorough in your domestic transformation. A ranch, community involvement, even a fiancé. You really committed to the role." Tom Bradley's voice carried across the church, heavy with the anger of a man who'd spent his life working honest land. "You're talking about stealing an entire community's livelihood." "I'm talking about claiming what was already stolen from its rightful owners," Cole corrected. "The territorial government, the railroad companies, they're the real thieves here. I'm simply collecting what's owed." Sheriff Murphy struggled to sit up straighter despite his wounds. "The law doesn't see it that way, Cole. Stolen goods don't become legitimate just because time passes." "The law?" Cole laughed. "You mean the same law that put bounties on our heads for taking from institutions that got rich off the blood and sweat of common people? I've learned to view legal definitions as merely suggestions." Outside, Jed could hear Cole's men moving into position, surrounding the church with the practiced efficiency of experienced fighters. Whatever happened next would need to happen soon, before their situation became completely hopeless. Sarah Hayes suddenly stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising strength. "Cole, you used me, perverted my brother's memory to serve your greed. That makes this personal." "Miss Hayes," Cole's voice carried mock sympathy. "You're distraught, understandably so, but you've served your purpose admirably. Walk away now, and I'll even let you keep the reward money I promised for delivering Rawlins." "I don't want your blood money," Sarah replied, her grip tightening on her pistol. "What I want is justice, real justice, not the twisted version you sold me." For the first time since the shooting began, Jed allowed himself to hope. They were still outnumbered and trapped, but they weren't facing this alone. The community that had given him a second chance was rallying together, and even Sarah Hayes, the woman who had come to kill him, was choosing to stand with them against the real enemy. The silence that followed Sarah's defiant declaration stretched taut as a wire fence in winter. Then Cole's laughter echoed through the broken windows, cold and genuinely amused. How touching. The hunter becomes the protector. But you're forgetting something important. Miss Hayes, you're trapped in there with wounded men and limited ammunition. While I have a dozen seasoned fighters surrounding the building, Jed was already moving, his years of tactical experience kicking in as he assessed their defensive position. The church's thick stone walls would stop most rifle rounds, but the windows were compromised, and there were too many angles of attack to cover effectively. They needed to change the dynamics of this fight, and quickly. "Tom, Jake, can either of you get to that rifle?" he asked quietly. "I can reach it," Tom Bradley confirmed, beginning to crawl toward the back pew, despite the risk of exposing himself to sniper fire. Doc Harrison had finished tending to Jake's leg wound and was now working his way toward Sheriff Murphy, his medical bag clutched in one hand and a small pistol, probably taken from Murphy's holster, gripped awkwardly in the other. The elderly physician had never been a fighting man, but the attack on his community had awakened something fierce in his normally gentle demeanor. Sarah Hayes moved to one of the side windows, her pistol held with the competent grip of someone who had indeed spent 3 years learning the deadly arts. "I count at least 4 men on this side," she reported quietly. "They're staying back, probably waiting for orders." Boone remained near the front window, his massive body coiled with tension as he watched for movement. The dog's presence was oddly comforting. In all their years together, Jed had never known the animal to fail in reading a dangerous situation. "Marcus!" Jed called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd once used to command the Devil's Canyon gang. "You want to do this the hard way? Because I remember how that usually worked out for people who crossed us." "Threats, Jed? From a man playing farmer in a church full of wounded civilians?" "You've gone soft." The Jed Rawlins I knew would have fought his way out by now. Damn the consequences. Maybe I've learned that some things are worth protecting more than they're worth abandoning. Cole's response came in the form of action rather than words. A flaming bottle arced through one of the broken windows, shattering against the wooden pew where Pete Wilson had been sheltering moments before. The elderly storekeeper rolled away as flames began to lick at the dry wood, filling the church with acrid smoke. "Fire," Doc Harrison said grimly. "He means to burn us out." Another bottle crashed through a different window, then a third. The ancient church, built from local timber and filled with decades of accumulated wooden furnishings, began to burn with alarming speed. The smell of smoke mixed with the sharper odor of whatever accelerant Cole's men were using, creating a choking atmosphere that made breathing difficult. "We have to move," Jed announced, his mind racing through their limited options. "Stay low, head for the back door." "Sarah, you take point. You know how these men think. Where can we go?" Tom Bradley asked, clutching Jake's rifle as smoke began to obscure their vision. "They've got the whole building surrounded." Jed's answer came from the tactical lessons learned during 5 years of outlaw warfare. "We don't run from them. We run toward them, hit them where they don't expect it." Sarah nodded, understanding, her teacher's mind adapting quickly to the brutal logic of survival. "The bell tower. If we can get up there, we'll have height advantage and a clear field of fire, and a way to signal the rest of the valley," Jake added through gritted teeth as Doc Harrison helped him to his feet. "My ranch hands will see the smoke and come running." The plan was desperate, requiring them to cross open ground while under fire, but it was better than burning alive in the church. Jed checked his pistol one final time, counting rounds and knowing they would have to make every shot count. "On my signal," he said, moving toward the back door with Boone padding silently beside him. "Sarah, you and Doc get Jake and Murphy to cover. Tom, Pete, lay down covering fire as best you can." Through the thickening smoke, Cole's voice carried with mocking confidence. "No way out, Jed. Surrender now and I might let the others live." Instead of answering, Jed kicked open the back door and dove into the afternoon sunlight, rolling to his feet with his pistol already tracking targets. The first of Cole's men was positioned behind the old oak tree, where he'd first met the woman he'd thought was Eloise Carter, and Jed's shot took him down before the outlaw could bring his rifle to bear. Behind him, the others poured out of the burning church like angry bees from a smoked hive, each of them carrying the desperate determination of people fighting for everything they held dear. The final battle for Sparrow Ridge had begun. The churchyard erupted in gunfire as Cole's men responded to Jed's breakout, their carefully planned ambush dissolving into the chaos of close-quarters combat. Sarah Hayes moved with deadly precision, her 3 years of training evident in every calculated step, as she provided covering fire for the wounded men struggling to reach the bell tower. Boone proved his worth once again, the massive dog launching himself at an outlaw who had flanked around the church's east side. The man's scream of terror cut through the gunfire as over 100 pounds of loyal fury brought him down, his rifle spinning away across the dusty ground. "The tower!" Jed shouted, putting 2 quick rounds into the window of the general store, where muzzle flashes had revealed another sniper. "Keep moving!" Doc Harrison half-carried Sheriff Murphy toward the bell tower's base, while Tom Bradley and Pete Wilson laid down suppressing fire with Jake's hunting rifle. The elderly storekeeper handled the weapon with surprising competence, his shots forcing Cole's men to keep their heads down as the group made their desperate dash across open ground. Jake Morrison hobbled along on his wounded leg, refusing Doc's attempts to help and instead clutching a pistol he'd retrieved from somewhere. Blood seeped through the bandage on his thigh, but his weathered face showed only grim determination. The bell tower loomed above them, its wooden ladder stretching up toward salvation or death, depending on whether they could reach it before Cole's men repositioned. Jed could hear Marcus's voice shouting orders from somewhere near the burning church, the gang leader's carefully controlled plan giving way to frustration as his targets refused to die quietly. "Sarah, up first," Jed commanded as they reached the tower's base. "You're the best shot and we need eyes up there." She didn't argue, holstering her pistol and beginning the climb with athletic grace despite her torn wedding dress. Halfway up, she called down, "I can see the whole valley from here. Riders coming from the north. Looks like help from the neighboring ranches. How long?" Tom Bradley asked, ejecting spent shells from the rifle. 10 minutes, maybe less. 10 minutes might as well have been 10 hours. Cole's men were already regrouping, using the cover of the burning church and surrounding buildings to advance on the tower. Jed could see at least 8 of them still in the fight, moving with the coordinated precision of experienced killers. Doc Harrison got Murphy up the ladder through sheer determination and medical knowledge of how to move wounded men. Pete Wilson followed, his face pale, but his jaw set with the resolve of someone defending his life's work. Tom Bradley went next, the rifle slung across his back as he climbed one-handed. That left Jed and Jake at the bottom, with Boone pacing anxiously between them and the approaching danger. The dog's amber eyes kept flicking between his master and the wounded rancher, as if calculating which one needed protection more. "Go," Jake said simply, checking his pistol cylinder. "I'll hold them as long as I can." "Like hell," Jed replied. "We go together, or not at all." A bullet spanged off the tower's wooden frame, inches from Jed's head, followed by another that sent splinters flying. Cole's men were getting closer, their fire becoming more accurate as they closed the distance. From above, Sarah's pistol cracked repeatedly, her shots forcing the advancing outlaws to seek better cover. "They're trying to circle around," she called down. "East side, behind Morrison's blacksmith shop." Jed made his decision. "Jake, up the ladder, now!" The rancher started to protest, but another volley of gunfire ended the argument. He began climbing, favoring his wounded leg, but moving steadily upward. Jed provided covering fire, his shots methodical and precise as muscle memory from his outlaw days took over. Boone suddenly stiffened, his hackles rising as he stared toward the burning church. Through the smoke and flames, a figure emerged. Marcus Cole himself, no longer content to direct the battle from a safe distance. He carried a rifle with practiced ease, his face wearing the cold smile Jed remembered from their worst days together. "Hello, old friend," Cole called out, his voice carrying easily across the churchyard. "Ready to finish what we started 5 years ago?" Jed's hands were steady as he faced his former lieutenant, but his heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment he'd been dreading since the day he decided to leave his old life behind, the reckoning, with the man who had shaped him into a killer and who now threatened. Everything he'd built, it's already finished. "Marcus," Jed replied, beginning his own climb up the ladder while keeping his pistol trained on Cole. Has been since the day I realized there was more to life than taking from others. Cole's laughter followed him up the ladder, along with the sound of approaching footsteps. Below, Boone remained at the tower's base, a four-legged guardian standing between the past and the future, ready to make his own stand in the coming moments. The bell tower's wooden platform creaked under the weight of 7 people, but it held firm as the final moments of the battle played out below. From their elevated position, Jed could see the full scope of Cole's assault on Sparrow Ridge, smoke rising from the bank where the robbery had taken place, scattered townspeople emerging from hiding places to assess the damage, and the dust cloud on the northern horizon that marked the approach of help from neighboring ranches. Marcus Cole stood in the churchyard like a general surveying his domain, his rifle held casually but ready. Around him, his remaining men waited for orders, their faces grim with the knowledge that their carefully planned operation had devolved into a desperate siege. "Last chance, Jed," Cole called up to the tower. "Come down and face me alone, and I'll let the others live. Keep hiding behind civilians, and I'll burn the whole valley before those riders arrive." Sarah Hayes checked her ammunition and found only 2 rounds remaining. The others were in similar straits, low on bullets and running out of time. But something had changed in the dynamic of their desperate situation. Instead of the scattered panic that had marked the initial attack, there was now a sense of unified purpose among the defenders. "He's bluffing," Sarah said quietly. Cole always was more bark than bite when his plans fell apart. Sheriff Murphy, despite his wounds, managed a weak smile. "Miss Hayes, I think you know our friend Marcus better than you realized." "Former friend," Jed corrected, checking his own remaining ammunition. 3 shots left, not enough for what needed to be done. "Marcus chose his path a long time ago, same as I chose mine." The sound of hoofbeats was growing closer, the cavalry arriving in the form of hard-working ranchers and their hands. Men who knew the value of community and weren't about to let outlaws destroy what they'd all built together. But they were still minutes away, and Cole showed no signs of waiting for their arrival. Below them, Boone had taken up position at the tower's base, his massive frame blocking the ladder. The dog's loyalty was absolute, prepared to defend his family regardless of the odds. Watching him, Jed felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same emotion he'd experienced when the townspeople had stood by him in the church, declaring him one of their own despite his past. "Doc," Jed said quietly, "that medical bag of yours, you wouldn't happen to have any laudanum in there?" Doc Harrison looked puzzled for a moment, then understanding dawned. "For pain relief?" "Yes, but not for pain. For other purposes." Jed's mind was working through possibilities, remembering tricks from his outlaw days that might serve a different purpose now. "Laudanum burns bright and hot when it hits flame." Tom Bradley caught on immediately. "You're thinking of a distraction." "I'm thinking of an ending," Jed replied, his gaze fixed on Marcus Cole. "One that doesn't involve any more innocent people getting hurt." Sarah understood as well, a teacher's quick mind grasping the implications. "You're going down there." "We're going down there," Jed corrected. "This started with the Devil's Canyon gang, and it needs to end the same way. But not with more killing if we can help it." The approaching riders were close enough now that individual figures could be distinguished. Ranch foremen Jed recognized, younger men whose faces he knew from church gatherings and barn raisings. The community that had embraced him was coming to his defense. Just as he was finally ready to defend them properly, "Marcus," Jed called down, his voice carrying the authority he'd once used to lead desperate men through impossible situations. "You want to finish this? Just you and me, no weapons." "The way we should have done it 5 years ago." Cole's laughter echoed off the surrounding buildings. "Hand to hand? You always were a romantic, Jed. But I didn't come this far to settle things with fisticuffs." "Then you're a coward, as well as a thief," Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly across the churchyard. "My brother died facing armed men with nothing but his badge and his principles. You can't even face one man without an army backing you up." The insult hit its mark. Cole's face darkened, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of wounded pride. Fine. Clear ground between the tower and the church. No tricks, no backup, just you and me settling old business. As if summoned by the moment, the church bell began to ring, not the measured tolling that called people to worship, but the rapid, urgent clanging that warned of fire or danger. Someone in the town, seeing the smoke and chaos, was spreading the alarm in the time-honored way. The sound seemed to crystallize something in all of them. This was their home, their sanctuary, their future being threatened by ghosts from a past that should have stayed buried. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Jed began his descent down the ladder, each rung taking him closer to a confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of everyone who had placed their trust in his transformation. In his vest pocket, the simple gold wedding ring pressed against his chest, no longer a symbol of dreams deferred, but a reminder of the life he'd built and the people he'd sworn to protect. Behind him, Sarah Hayes followed, her torn wedding dress a strange banner of defiance against the man who had manipulated them both. Below, Boone waited with the infinite patience of a creature who understood that some fights were worth everything, even life itself. The final reckoning had come to Sparrow Ridge, and Jed Rawlins, former outlaw, current protector, was ready to meet it head-on.